Good morning, everybody. The number of times that Alana or Don have introduced me by saying that I'm someone who doesn't need introducing has now come home to roost, because Paul McKechnie has decided I really need no introducing. When I was originally given the topic of the conference booklet in front of me says the topic is orality and memory in the New Testament, but the original version that I was given was eyewitnesses, orality, memory in the New Testament, and I decided what I'd do is talk about all of them. But in the process of developing the talk, it's turned into something slightly larger, and I'm going to be speaking to you about the balance between eyewitnesses, social memory, oral tradition, and theological development in the gospel tradition, by which I mean primarily the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, with the question, what can we know? What can we know with confidence about the balance between these various factors? It's widely agreed that the complex pattern of agreements and variations that we find in the parallel accounts in the Gospels, the synoptic Gospels in particular, is the result of the processes of transmission which took place between the time of Jesus' public career and the final writing of these Gospels, roughly 35 to 40 years for the first of them. Stories about Jesus' doings and reports of his teaching were originally passed on by eyewitnesses, then by their early audiences, at first in oral form and then increasingly also in written collections. And these were used by groups of his disciples, both during his lifetime and even more so after his death, to remember, to interpret, and to apply his message to the changing situations in which the Jesus movement, long before it was called Christianity, found itself. In this process, the stories were selected, collected, edited, reorganized, developed, translated into Greek, and eventually included in the narrative collections we now know as the Gospels. Now, very few would doubt that original eyewitnesses took an important part in at least the early stages of passing on these reports. And likewise, most would agree that in the largely illiterate rural population of Galilee, Judea, and also in the cities of the wider Roman Empire, the process began in spoken form and in group contexts. The level of variation we find in the written Gospels strongly suggests that the theological perspectives of different individuals and groups influence the details of the reports, both in terms of their actual wording and in terms of the literary context in which they now find themselves. In other words, it's not just the actual wording, it's also the implications of the context in the narrative. But can we tell now which aspects of the written Gospels reflect early eyewitness memory, which aspects reflect the influence of the process of oral transmission, and which have been shaped by the developing theological views of the early followers of Jesus, whether these be Galilean eyewitnesses or later Greek-speaking urban disciples? Can a close comparative study of parallel gospel accounts distinguish the different factors that are at work? And if they can, to what degree of certainty can they do it? I'll begin this issue with a number of case studies of what I called earlier the complex pattern of agreement and variation that we find in parallel accounts to illustrate what the possibilities are. And then I'll focus on the question of eyewitnesses, as it has become a feature of the debate in scholarship in the last 30 years or so. The first passage I'd like to deal with is the passage in which Jesus is anointed by a woman, and something of this sort is reported in 4 Gospels, all 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they report it in a way that suggests that some sort of complex interwoven development has taken place. In all the accounts, Jesus is anointed with perfume by a woman. But, as you can see from the highlighted passages here, in Matthew, Mark, and John, the event takes place in Bethany. In Luke, the location is just not specified at all. In Matthew and Mark, the homeowner is Simon the leper. In Luke, it is Simon, again, the Pharisee. Now, whether you can be a Pharisee and a leper simultaneously is not discussed, but it's Simon nonetheless. But in John, it is quite unclear whose house we're in, but it's probably the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, because they're running the show. Then Jesus is anointed with perfume by somebody. In Matthew and Mark, it's just a woman. In Luke, it's a woman who had lived a sinful life in that town. In John, it's specifically Mary of Bethany. Note, not Mary of Magdala, later the sinful woman par excellence, though not really until the 6th century AD when Pope Gregory the Great made that identification quasi-canonical. But the important point is, in Matthew and Mark, it's just a woman. In Luke, it's a woman who'd lived a sinful life in that town, and we always think that's got to be Mary the prostitute, because a woman couldn't live a sinful life of any other kind, surely. I mean, she couldn't be an embezzler. But in John, it's specifically Mary. In Matthew and Mark, the woman, whoever she is, has an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume. In Luke, it's an alabaster jar of perfume, expensive, not specified. And in John, it's just an expensive perfume, jar not specified. Intriguingly, in Mark and John, it's pistic nard, whatever that is. Pistikos ought to be an adjective meaning faithful, but how a perfume can be faithful is not made clear. It probably means, and is usually translated as, very pure nard, but we don't really know for sure, and what matters is that only Mark and John mention this interesting detail. Now we get to the complexities. In Matthew and Mark, whatever this perfume was, the woman, whoever she was, poured it on Jesus' head. In Luke and John, she poured it on his feet and wiped them with her hair. And in Mark only, she broke the jar to do all this. Now the story continues. In Matthew, the disciples are indignant about the waste of the perfume. In Mark, it's not quite so clear who's indignant. It's some of those present. In John, it is quite specifically Judas. In Luke, the indignation is implicit rather than explicit, and it's not about the perfume. Simon the Pharisee is upset about Jesus permitting the woman to touch him. But somebody is upset about something, that's clear. Then we have the intriguing detail of the value of the perfume. In Matthew, it could have been sold at a high price. In Mark, it could be sold for 300 denarii. That is a high price. And in John, it could be sold for a year's wages, which is close enough to 300 denarii. In other words, it's three different ways of saying what is essentially the same thing. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus says, "Why are you bothering her?" In Mark and John, he says, "Leave her alone." In Luke, it's entirely different. Very few parallels at all at this point in the story. In Matthew, Mark, and John, Jesus says, "You will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." And in John's Gospel only, this is the passage highlighted in red, the action the woman has taken is related to Jesus' burial. That may have been implicit in the others, but it's certainly not explicit. Finally, the biggest difference of all is not in the passages, but in their location. In Matthew, Mark, and John, the event takes place in the last 10 days of Jesus' life. In Luke, the location is indeterminate, but it's clearly much earlier, because as the passage shows you on the top, it's in Luke chapter 7, not at the end of the Gospel. So, there's a quick survey of the similarities and differences across the four accounts. My question to you is simple. What's going on here? The answer is not as simple as the question. How many times was Jesus anointed by a woman? Is it only once? If it is only once, then we must deduce that the story has gone through considerable development in the transmission to end up with these four varying accounts, the most different of which is clearly Luke. Okay, if we're not comfortable with that solution, perhaps there were two anointings. Matthew, Mark, and John, that's one, and it's in the last 10 days of Jesus' life. And Luke, much earlier, and a different woman, the sinful one. But we still have multiple problems, like, was it his head or was it his feet? Is it possible that there were three anointings? This seems to be the least likely, but it would make sense that Matthew and Mark are reporting the same story because they're very close and very similar in many ways. John is reporting a different story. That's the one with Mary of Bethany. And Luke, a third story. But the odds against this seem to me to be ridiculous because, to put it simply, it seems most unlikely that Jesus was anointed by a woman with perfumed oil twice in the last 10 days of his life, and all the rest of the details that go with it. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, there is no perfect solution to this question. It could be one, it could be two, or it could be three. But what does seem clear is that there's some level of literary dependence. Matthew seems to be so closely related to Mark that we have to posit that one of them is copying from the other. Luke is significantly different. John is much more closely related to Matthew and Mark, but has details nobody else has. This looks more like a case of oral transmission, where details could migrate between different versions of the story much more easily than they could in written copying. There's some degree of theological development, because only in John, usually thought to be the last of the Gospels, is the story linked to the necessity for Jesus to be anointed for his burial. And there are possible eyewitness features. John's identification of the disciple who became indignant as Judas, the detail of the breaking of the jar, all of those might be considered details that an eyewitness would remember that would be included. But we don't really know. So far, all we've got is all these factors being involved. Now, that's a complicated story, or rather a complicated set of stories. I'd like to choose a couple now of much simpler ones that we can deal with and have a little bit more clarity. The stilling of the storm on the Lake of Galilee is told in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And there are multiple details across all three accounts and some striking divergences. The storm itself is described differently, though most English translations do tend to blur this. In Mark, it's described as a great storm of wind, specifically. Lailaps megale anamu. In Matthew, it's simply seismos megas. But that's very different because seismos is the normal term for an earthquake, not a windstorm. The English translation obscures that fact. What's going on there? In Luke, it's simply a storm of wind. Not necessarily a great one, and certainly not an earthquake. Secondly, Jesus' response to the disciples is subtly different in each case. In Mark, he says to them, "Have you still no faith?" In Matthew, this has been modified to, "You little faiths." Not none, just a bit. And in Luke, it's more general, "Where is your faith?" But what's really interesting is the different things that the disciples call Jesus as they wake him up. In Mark, he's simply teacher, didaskale. And the question is, don't you care that we're perishing, brackets, in this storm? In Luke, it's very similar, but it's not teacher, it's master. We are perishing, not don't you care. In Matthew, it's strikingly different. It's Lord, save us, we are perishing. And it's important to get the Greek here in each case, because in Mark, the teacher is didaskale. In Luke, master is epistates. And in Matthew, Lord, save us is Kyrie soson, which is much more clearly theological language in both cases. There are possible eyewitness details, like the fact that Jesus was asleep on a cushion, which seems to have no point whatsoever. And the question we're dealing with now is, what's going on here? Are there multiple eyewitness details? And one disciple said each of teacher, master, and Lord. And different people have simply reported different versions. Or is it that teacher wasn't strong enough for Matthew and Luke, and they've replaced it with something more theologically appropriate from their point of view? There's a fairly simple case, again, simple to ask the question, not quite so easy to answer. Let's have a look at another example where there's a striking difference that most people don't notice. And that's in the parable of the tenants in the vineyard, not an event in Jesus' life in this case, but a story he told. In the parable of the tenants, we have a fairly well-known story about a man planting a vineyard, setting it up with the winepress, the details of how he hired tenant farmers to run it, and then when he sent messengers to them to get the crop at the end of the season, dreadful things happened, including when he sent his son. In the second part of the story, we get the details of what happened to the son. And in Mark, the tenant farmers took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. Now, there's a slight difference in both Matthew and Luke. Both Matthew and Luke changed the order of events to threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Why? Had they simply heard a different version of the story? In that case, where did the different version come from? What's the point? I think here there is a strong case to say that there's a theological point being made in Matthew and Luke that is not in Mark. Because when Jesus, the Son, sent by the Father, was killed, he was taken outside Jerusalem and crucified, thrown out of the vineyard, symbolically Jerusalem, and killed. And Mark doesn't suggest that strongly, but Matthew and Luke have both decided to make it clearer. So that looks like a fairly open and shut case of theological development in the tradition. But it's worth noticing that Mark hasn't got it. Mark appears not to be trying to make the theological point. Mark is, in fact, simply, as far as we can tell, reporting the story as Jesus told it. and this has been argued by at least James Charlesworth and Richard Horsley as a strong case for Mark's version being original and probably authentic. There are other reasons in their argument as well. There are many other features of this story that would be worth following up in another context, including the fact that it's fairly clearly got an Aramaic underlay somewhere, because the parable talks about the son who was rejected, and then straight away shifts the topic, in the words of Jesus, to the stone that was rejected. Now, son and stone in Greek and in English are completely different words, but in Aramaic, the difference is a pun, because son is ben, and stone is eben. The eben that was rejected is the ben that was rejected. There's a link there that doesn't show up in the Greek, but it's there in Aramaic, very probably. Another quick example, when Jesus goes back to Nazareth after travelling around Galilee for a while, he's described as defining himself as a prophet without honour in his own country. Mark says something quite remarkable in his version of the story. He says, when Jesus was doubted by his fellow townspeople, he could do no deed of power, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. That's a pretty big except. But Matthew is not comfortable with this, and very clearly says, and he did no deed of power because of their unbelief. Not his fault, theirs. Now, it seems to me that there we're dealing with a change that is probably theologically motivated, probably a theological development. The story in Luke is entirely different. It still has the business of Jesus being treated and describing himself as a prophet without honour in his own country, but the rest of the context is very different, and it's probably essentially a different story, whether it was originally or whether because of Luke's editing we haven't discussed at all. The final example I want to deal with you is the story where, quite late in his career, Jesus is approached by a person asking him to solve a difficult problem for him. And the question is, what do I do to inherit eternal life? Or what command or what good deed must I do? Or in general terms, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says the most remarkable thing. In Mark, he says, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. Almost identical in Luke. But Matthew is not comfortable with this and changes it to, why do you ask me about what is good? There is only one who is good, brackets, and I don't need to tell you who. This seems to be a case where Mark is quite comfortable reporting that Jesus said something that made it clear that Jesus himself was not God, because you shouldn't call Jesus good because only God was good. And perhaps it's possible that Mark is hinting there's something more complex going on. Matthew, on the other hand, is clearly not comfortable that we'll get the hint, theologically, and has Jesus not say, why do you call me good? But rather, why do you ask me about what goodness is? A different and softer thing. Now, I've got one more case study. I think I said that was the last, but it was only the second last. And this is the one that's actually late in Jesus' career while he's teaching in the temple, probably in the last 10 days of his life. And here Jesus asks the question, how can your scribes, your theologians, say that the Messiah is the son of David? Because David himself, inspired by the Holy Spirit, declared, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand, etc. Then Jesus draws the conclusion. If David calls him the Lord, the Messiah the Lord, How can he be David's son? David would not describe his own son as his Lord. Now, what's intriguing in this case is that all three of the gospel writers keep this story, even though it has Jesus explicitly doubting the question that none of them doubted, which is that the Messiah was the son of David, i.e. Jesus. Clearly, the gospel writers all believe that, but they are willing to report that Jesus raised doubts about it, and they don't say, of course, he didn't really mean it. They simply report that he taught it. This seems to me to be a case where you must argue that whatever the origins of the story, it is likely to be historically accurate, because no early Christian writer is going to make it up, not to raise that puzzle of is the Messiah really the son of David, unless Jesus himself really said it. Okay, there's a whole set of rather different case studies. I would suggest to you that these cases suggest that in the gospel tradition we have a combination of written transmission in some cases, particularly obvious in the case where Matthew sticks very, very close to Mark, group oral transmission with a degree of variation in the storytelling, possible eyewitness origins for the stories, and in some cases, a degree of theological development from writer to writer. Now, in the last century or so of biblical scholarship, these broad data have led to three overall approaches to the Gospels that we're now going to survey very quickly. The first is the view taken particularly by the continental and English language form critics in the first half of the 20th century, and still to an extent after that as well. They described what was going on as free performance oral tradition, where a story is told and passed on from person to person, and over time changes quite radically in some cases, because nobody's terribly worried about what the original form of the story was. They're just passing on what they've heard. Now, some years ago, I was giving a talk on this topic to a Christian group at New South Wales University, and I was about to say, this is what we call Chinese whispers. And then I looked carefully at the audience and realized that at least half of them were probably Chinese. This is one of those moments that speakers dread. And I thought to myself, right, do you call it Australian whispers? And they were happy with that. But free, informal oral tradition is clearly the style of oral tradition in which stories generally change over time, sometimes to the point of being unrecognizable. Not always. Verse sticks much better. Jokes stick much better because they have a structure that keeps the story coherent. But stories in general and reports of teaching might well vary a great deal. That view, that the Gospels were the creation of essentially anonymous groups of Christians retelling in different contexts stories that in many ways became unrecognizable over time, was the view of the more skeptical scholarship in the first half of the 20th century. But in the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, a number of scholars, particularly Scandinavian scholars, Harold Reisenfeld and Birger Gerhardsen most notably among them, argued that that is not the way oral tradition worked in antiquity. They argued that particularly in Jewish culture, there was a settled practice of careful formal memorization, which you particularly find in rabbinic writings of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, where the teacher will say, here is the teaching that I passed on from my master Eleazar, and the mnemonic trick you will use to remember it is as follows. And then they'd tell you the mnemonic trick to use to remember it. And you would memorize it until you had it right. And then you would pass it on, and this would be formal controlled oral tradition. And it works, in general, very well. It's not perfect, but then nothing is. But it doesn't end you up with the Chinese whispers game. Now, scholars had two problems with this view. I'm simplifying, of course. One was that the evidence that rabbis did such things nearly always came from the 3rd century AD or later. The second was the Gospels didn't look that perfect. And over time, particularly in the 90s of the 20th century, a third view, community-controlled, informal oral tradition, was developed first of all by Kenneth Bailey and then by a number of other scholars, including James Dunn, to argue that what was going on that produced the Gospels was a process whereby multiple original witnesses told the story to multiple groups, particularly in communities, and that these communities then retold the story but corrected each other along the way. When the story began to change, someone would say, hang on, I was there and that isn't what happened. And this was then put forward as a better model for explaining the combination of variation and stability that you find in the Gospels. Now, most importantly for our progress today, this was developed in two important ways in the late 20th and early 21st century by a number of scholars. By a number of scholars who began to take very seriously the fact that memorization was a part of the educational system for the whole Greco-Roman world, including the Jewish world. And this was the case not just in the 3rd century AD, but as far back into the pre-Roman period as you wanted to go. Secondly, and this is particularly the work, excuse me, of Richard Bauckham, there was strong evidence that the early Christian movement in the 1st century and in the 2nd century was very interested in the role that eyewitnesses had played in the transmission. And this led to another version of this same model, informal community-controlled oral tradition that included eyewitnesses. Who were the people who really could say, hang on a minute, I was there? You're beginning to twist this story. At least they could say that if they were there, where the story was being told, not merely when it originated. This developed in the scholarship of Loveday Alexander in England, Samuel Bierskog in Scandinavia, Richard Bauckham himself in Scotland and then in England. And what they essentially set out to do was show that orality is not stupid. And in fact, in the complex literate and oral culture of the 1st century AD, there were many highly literate people who nonetheless actively preferred oral teaching. This includes, for example, the great Roman orator Quintilian at the end of the 1st century, who actually made the comment in his Institutes of Oratory that the only reason for writing out a speech is so that you can memorize it by reading it again and again and again. He wouldn't otherwise write a speech out. In other words, even as educated a writer, not just a speaker, but a writer, as Quintilian, honoured orality as superior. This was also true of a large range of different educational fields. It wasn't simply true in rhetoric, it was also true among craftsmen, far less literate, because it expressed the widely felt difficulty of learning practical skills without a live demonstration and somebody explaining what's going on. But in the whole education system more generally, we have to be reminded that teaching was primarily person-to-person oral instruction. with books as a backup only. Bierskog points out in his essay From Memory to Memoirs, tracing the background of a literary genre in 2012, that Seneca the Elder, the father of the famous Seneca the philosopher, boasted that in his youth he could repeat 2,000 names that had been read to him, and that he could recite over 200 verses, not only forwards, but backwards. He described this as a true miraculum. I'm sure he was exaggerating, but his boasting is a reminder of the vital importance for anyone who wished to speak and write persuasively to have a good and accurate memory. The same is true in reports in Pliny the Elder's Natural History, where he reports a number of cases of really staggering feats of memory, including the fact that one particular commander was said to know the names of every major Roman family. That was Lucius Scipio. However, what Richard Bauckham showed beyond this was that first and secondary early Christians clearly claimed that eyewitnesses mattered. Eusebius quotes Papias of Hierapolis, writing in the early 2nd century AD, and I'm going to step away from the microphone for a moment so you can see more of the passage and I can read it with you. Papias is quoted by Eusebius as saying, "I shall not hesitate also to put into properly ordered form for you everything I learned carefully in the past, from the elders and noted down well, for the truth of which I vouch." He's writing, but he's writing what he learnt verbally. Unlike most people, I did not enjoy those who have a great deal to say, but those who teach the truth. Nor do I enjoy those who recall someone else's commandments, but those who remember the commandments given by the Lord to the faith and proceeding from the truth itself. But how did he learn those things? If by chance someone who had been in attendance on the elders should come my way, I inquired about the words of the elders. That is, what the elders had said, Andrew or Peter had said, or Philip or Thomas or James, or John or Matthew. Now notice, those are all names of disciples of Jesus. Or any other of the Lord's disciples for that matter. Now I can't quite see the name that the desk is shadowing there. But he also commented that he liked to hear from stories of Aristion and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, and what they were still saying. In other words, he wasn't just interested in second-hand stories about what the disciples said, Jesus said. He was particularly interested in what Aristion and John were still saying, that is to say, when he was younger. He's clearly emphasizing that what he liked the most, and was now writing down, was first-hand tradition and second-hand tradition. But he liked first most of all. Just a moment. Another Christian writer in the early 2nd century, Quadratus, of whom we have only this fragment, but we know that he wrote under Hadrian because Eusebius tells us so. He comments, "The works of our Saviour were always present, for they were true." Well, that's interesting. Don't quite know what it means. But then he explains, "Those who were healed, those who rose from the dead, those who were not only seen in the act of being healed or raised, but were also always present, not merely when the Saviour was living on earth, but also for a considerable time after his departure, so that some of them survived even to our own times." Quadratus is again saying, I'm really interested in what eyewitnesses, either those who had things happen to them or those who saw the things happen, what they told us. Now that's where Bauckham's argument about eyewitnesses begins. First of all, with the cultural context and its fascination with oral teaching. Second, with the fact that Paul in the 1st century, John in the 1st century, Papias and Quadratus in the 2nd century reporting back into the 1st century, and later writers such as Eusebius all emphasize the importance of eyewitness testimony. Bochum points out that Papias is not speaking about some vague oral tradition. Rather, he is talking about specific named people that he considers to be reliable eyewitnesses of the events of Jesus' lifetime. The same is true of Quadratus, though he doesn't give names. Now, having started there, Bochum points out that there may well be evidence in the Gospels themselves to suggest that eyewitnesses are being commented on or reported from. And he argues that all this evidence strongly suggests that at least some of the oral traditions of the words and deeds of Jesus were attached in the early stages of the tradition to specific named eyewitnesses. People like Mary, Jesus' mother. People like Mary, the other one, who was at the crucifixion and at the tomb afterwards. People like Simon of Cyrene, mentioned specifically in Mark's Gospel as having carried Jesus' cross. You all know him. He's the one whose sons were Alexander and Rufus, says Mark. And there are a number of other cases that he suggests that strongly suggest that some stories in the Gospels were passed on directly by eyewitnesses, as well as being transmitted through the broader process of oral tradition. The question that this leaves us, or rather the two questions, are: can we tell which parts of the gospel traditions fall into this category of being eyewitness evidence? And can we tell how much modification they may have undergone in the process of reaching the form in which we now have them? Because nobody is claiming, the Gospels themselves do not claim, that the stories are reported by eyewitnesses. None of the Gospels except John's Gospel makes that claim. And even John's Gospel makes it in a highly coy fashion. Bochum argues that the following clues suggest that a passage derives from eyewitnesses: the presence of named individuals, because, as he points out, the great majority of individuals in the Gospels are not named. But where someone is named, he suggests we ought to look for the reason for the name being given. And among them are Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, Simon of Cyrene, Bartimaeus the blind beggar. People of this sort are mentioned, Bochum argues, because they were the origin of the story. Then he looks more broadly and looks at what he calls an inclusio of eyewitness testimony, where particularly in Mark begins his gospel mentioning Peter and the disciples and ends his gospel with Peter and the disciples, and in between is the material that, Bochum argues, implicitly comes from Peter and the disciples, though through a process that he doesn't specify. Then there are other narrative features that Bochum argues also suggest eyewitness evidence. Now, these clues might all together suggest a basis in eyewitness testimony, but they don't tell us two highly important things. They don't tell us whether this evidence is genuine or just a literary device attempting to make the Gospels persuasive. And they don't tell us to what degree the passage has been modified either by the original witness or by the later transmitters. We can get a handle on that by comparing the different versions that we have. But it's not clear to me that we can get back to what the eyewitnesses say. Now, Bochum tries to strengthen his overall case with a very sophisticated argument based on the statistical commonness of names in the Gospels and in other sources of information. And for this he has good evidence to use. he has Tal Elan's magnificent collection of all the known Jewish names in the first century and how often they come up. And he compares the statistics of that collection with the statistics in the Gospels and argues that there really is a difference between the names in the Gospels and the names in the general population. And he draws the conclusion from this that it is likely that the Gospel writers aren't just randomly making up names. Because if they did just randomly make up names, those aren't the ones they'd use. They'd use the more common ones. Now, this argument can be extended, and I don't know whether anyone has done this. Bochum mentions that there is also evidence, not just from the Palestinian Jewish world, but from the wider Greco-Roman Jewish world, of which names were common in the diaspora. And those are even more different. So if the Gospels were being transformed, or perhaps even reinvented in the diaspora, it's even less likely that the characteristically Jewish names would be used for the disciples. And Bochum makes the point that in some of the later apocryphal Gospels, this is exactly what you find. In one of them, Jesus goes to school where he's being taught Greek, and one of his school students, fellow students, is a young fellow called Zeno, which is a very Greek name and not a Jewish one at all. In other words, where fictional writers make up names for the stories around Jesus, they don't do it terribly well. Perhaps they're just not worried. Now, this argument is interesting and really quite impressive with the sophistication that Bochum gives it. But a number of scholars, particularly Gregor and Blyce, one Czech and one American scholar, in a couple of articles, have done a bit of a statistical analysis on Bochum's data and have come to the conclusion that his argument doesn't statistically prove what he wants it to. So there's a debate here that has not finished and is still going on. Can I ask you to note that Bochum is very careful not to argue for eyewitness evidence on the basis of vivid detail, which is the intuitive basis for saying that looks like an eyewitness. No one but an eyewitness would mention that. Bochum knows that that's a fallacious argument, and he says, we might well expect a story told by eyewitnesses to incorporate vivid details of visual or oral recollection, not strictly necessary to the story. But such details certainly cannot prove that we are dealing with eyewitness testimony, and too much has sometimes been made of the vivid details in Mark's narrative. An imaginative and skilled storyteller can also write with vivid detail. So this feature of Mark's narratives may be evidence only of Mark's artistry. That's not a good argument, as far as Bochum is concerned, and I think Bochum is right. But it's clear to me that Bochum's own argument is considerably more forceful and sophisticated. Bochum then postulates 5 main factors to account for the differences between the traditions that we find in the Gospels, if they are based on, partly at least, eyewitness evidence. Jesus doubtless used some of his own teachings more than once. So different versions of particular teachings might well have circulated, both or all of them being authentic, simply that Jesus had used the same illustration several times in several different contexts and modified it, as lecturers tend to do. That works well for teachings. It doesn't work well for events. Then he says the second factor is that you can have varying translations from Aramaic into Greek, and these may well lead to different versions becoming available in different Gospels. There are clearly some cases where this is the case. Then he talks about the variability normal in oral performance, especially narrative, and has no doubt that this is part of what's going on. And he then argues that many differences, especially in the sayings, will be deliberate alterations or additions. In other words, the Gospel writers do have a part to play, both in terms of the editing of the actual words and in the narrativization, the linking thematically into a story that the Gospels produce. What Bauckham is really saying is not, we've got a clue here that huge amounts of the Gospels can be proven to be eyewitness material. What he's saying is far too much of scholarship has failed to take seriously the clear evidence that the early Christians were interested in eyewitness testimony, at least in principle, and therefore the view that the oral tradition was free-flowing, informal, Chinese whispers. That theory looks particularly weak and doesn't explain the ways in which the tradition maintains itself reasonably steadily. Now, since then, the debate has continued. Bauckham has brought out a second edition of his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. He's run an enormous number of seminars and discussions, both orally and in print, on the whole question. And his constructive case leaves us with the following ongoing questions. The Gospels may present some of what they say as eyewitnesses, but is that purely a literary device, or is it a historical reality? If it's a historical reality, how do we go about defining which passages are eyewitness bits? And a crucial question, how good is eyewitness testimony anyway? Now there, I think Bauckham has a perfectly valid answer that he can give, though I don't think he does, which is, however good it is, it's better than not. Because that which is not eyewitness testimony has all the problems that eyewitness testimony may have, and its own problems as well. How aware of the issue were ancient people? Broadly speaking, very aware. And the Gospels themselves produce evidence of both continuity and change in the tradition. One extra development has come up that I'll finish with, and that is that there's been an intriguing debate between Bauckham himself and the American historical Jesus scholar Dale Allison, because Allison, quite independently of Bauckham, has argued that what we should do when we analyse the Gospels is not just look for the bits that we can be absolutely confident are historical. Because he says essentially, the general picture is more likely to be historically accurate than any particular individual story. Any particular individual story may have its own problems. We'd have to deal with every case. But for example, nobody seriously doubts that Jesus was known in his lifetime as an exorcist. You may have doubts about the historicity or the meaning of any particular story about Jesus exorcising, but there are simply too many of them for the whole thing to be made up. Allison therefore argues that the general picture of Jesus in the Gospels is more likely to be historically accurate than any particular saying. And he gives the rather delightful example of the fact that he himself has a reputation as an absent-minded professor. And he reports that there are at least 3 stories he's been told by his students that are incidents of him being an absent-minded professor. So he's quite sure he must be, but he doesn't remember any of the actual events. Now that seems to me to be a perfect little piece of irony. It does remind me, however, that approximately 50 years ago, I took part in lectures at Macquarie University from Edwin Judge, and I have absolutely clear memories of several features of them, at least in part because I mimicked them ruthlessly. I can't tell you the details of each particular lecture, but I can tell you that my opinion, for what it's worth, is that I remember the details of Edwin's lectures really quite well. I wonder whether he remembers that little incident of mimicry. Let's leave it for now. There we have an introduction to the whole question of eyewitness testimony oral memory, oral tradition, and theological development in the Gospels as we have them. But it's deliberately inconclusive, because to really answer the question, we've really got to do a lot more case studies and see what the general pattern turns out to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that. It certainly gave us a balanced view of eyewitness and social memory, oral tradition, and theological development in the gospel tradition. I actually knew a fellow who could recite the fairy tale of Cinderella backwards. So that's in modern day times. So we still...
Correct that? I think you mean the story of Rindercilla and the Three Sugliisters. Not quite the same as backward, but I know your point.
Yes, he could read backwards. We were all amazed. So thank you very much. Where are you going? You want to? The people want to ask questions or give some. Elena, thanks.
Chris, there was no intention to eliminate eyewitnesses. In fact, the springboard for this conference was, in fact, a rereading of Borkham's book. However, it just seemed a bit of a cumbersome title, and I think it sort of dropped out in that way. But it was essentially about opsis, as the Greeks knew very well. So thank you. I could say some other things, among them the fact that my own mother was naughty at boarding school and was told to overnight to learn 1,000 lines of Hiawatha and recite to the teacher the next day. So yes, people did have better memories probably a couple of generations ago, and
they
certainly
better memories from intensive practice.
Yes, and certainly thousands of years ago. Anyway, just to say that eyewitness was always a central part of this.
Chris, thanks for your superb presentation. I know that in this company it is not the right thing to do to distinguish between modern and ancient history. But I think it's very important to take into account the fact that Borkham started off as a modern historian. And therefore, he could not quite understand why the New Testament scholars and critics were as sceptical as they were. And in particular, he made a study of the impact of specific exceptional events on eyewitness testimony. And eyewitness testimony to exceptional events like Hiroshima, he talks about Hiroshima. I talk about mine disasters. The memories of people like that are very vivid and are retained in a way that the normal events are not retained. Now, the thing about Jesus is that the experience of being with Jesus was an exceptional event, and therefore I think that's one of the reasons why Borkham thinks that testimony should be taken seriously. So you played down the importance of vivid detail. I thought that he was quite strong on the importance of vivid detail, actually.
I think you're right that he was strong on the importance of vivid events, but not necessarily that vivid, irrelevant detail proved eyewitness testimony, because it may well just prove skillful, vivid writing. But you're quite right, he did use those examples and examples related to the Holocaust as well. This is one area where there has been other scholarship that I didn't have time to mention on the psychology of memory. And I think the short comment that has to be made is that Borkham is at least half right, but not completely right on how such memories are remembered. Many people argue that he is too credulous of eyewitness memory in some cases. But the difficulty then comes in applying this to particular stories in the Gospels or particular categories of stories in the Gospels, which is where the debate with Dale Allison becomes quite interesting. And that's the point of your question. Right. I'll remember that.
If you've got any, we've got to finish at that because we're running over time. But if you have any questions, you can see Chris, you'll stick around for a while, Chris.
Yes.
And you can put them to Chris. The other thing is that we have a lot of new docs, volumes there at the back, and they're free. So you can take whatever you want from that pile there. We're going to have morning tea now, and then afterwards we'll resume. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.